And I would like to introduce Jim Cullen, who is our presenter for today. Jim is the executive director of the Revelstoke Heritage Railway Society. His career spans 3 decades in human resources and general management in the corporate, nonprofit, and museum sectors, and a parallel volunteer career with several railway museums in leadership, operating, and collection roles, and serving on many nonprofit boards. So thanks for joining us today, Jim. Looking forward to your presentation, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Good morning to everybody. My ancestral homeland is, in fact, the Kindersley-Merrington district. So I'm especially delighted to see all of you in Saskatchewan from my new perch here in Revelstoke, because I moved here just last year, a year ago this month, actually. Is the screen share working, Em?
Yeah, it looks good.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm speaking to you from the ancestral and unceded territories of the Syilx, Secwepemc, Ktunaxa, and Shuswap nations here in Revelstoke, and I will govern myself with respect and honor. I'm so pleased to be here. The presentation I have for you today is something I've done in various formats. As Cal Sexsmith knows, I've been talking about this stuff for a really long time, and I did a master's degree in 2017, and this was the basis for my dissertation. So it's on a topic I really, really care about. I'm really fascinated personally with the public value of museums and the sustainability of museums. And I'm going to make a pitch that significance assessment is a key part of these. Okay, now, why can't I advance this slide? There we go. We're going to cover a lot of content today. And what I really hope this does is it helps you think of your own institution's significance assessment processes and philosophies and how it's working for you, or if not, why not? As you saw from the promotion for this session, my thing is trains. I developed this framework based on the concept of a distributed national collection of railways for Canada. But lest you worry about that, even though the context is trains today, this framework is something that you could use on any collection. And I developed it based on a lot of input and research with maritime, aviation, and railway museums. I know this is called Community Conversations, but it'll help me stay on time if we hold your questions to the end, if that's all right. So I'm going to talk about what it is, why bother, what is the state of the art that I found in my research, and what I recommend. And as a facilitator for 3 decades, I know that the answer you get from a question depends on the question you ask. It can vary a lot. And a fundamental premise of what I'm going to say to you today is, rather than looking at something in a binary way, is this thing significant or isn't it? I want you to think of things through the lens of why is this thing significant? That why is, I think, the key to future relevance of our collections, of our institutions, our sustainability. Significance is not binary. It doesn't flip on and off. It's a matter of degree. And particularly when you think about museums, because we work in the context of forever. It's comforting to know that we can think about it through a number of perspectives and come to that understanding of why something is significant, why it might matter, how it might matter or make meaning for future generations. Significance is in the literature, and I did a big literature review for my dissertation. It most often is summed up like this. It's the importance of an object determined by the aggregate of values and meanings. And the literature sometimes really mangles that up, but it kind of boils down to its values, its meanings. And when you think about it, you hear a lot about the values of a heritage building or the meaning of an object. So this should feel fairly familiar right out of the chute. In terms of values, let's just unbundle that really quickly. The Oxford English Dictionary says value is a worth or a quality measured by a standard of equivalence, or worth based on esteem, quality viewed in terms of importance or usefulness or desirability. Practically speaking, we tend to preserve what we value. The stuff in your collections is there because presumably somebody thought it was of value in some sense or other. And values is plural rather than singular. It's not monetary value. It's a spectrum of values, and they vary by frame of reference or the type of collections. The values that you look at a paleontology collection are different than the values you look at in a railway museum or an art museum. The thing that really struck me, one of my major aha moments when I was doing my dissertation, was that values are assigned by society. They're not baked into an object. And if you're an enthusiast, I don't care if it's locomotives or whales or whatever, when you're with those objects that you're so familiar with, I think it feels like it's intrinsic. You can read that object and the meanings and the values are very apparent to you. But the reality is society assigns values and society's values change over time. And the values of future generations don't necessarily equal the values of past generations. Just look at the amount of grandma's china that's in secondhand stores. That was valuable to grandma, but if we can't put it in the dishwasher now, modern people don't think it's very valuable at all. Crude metaphor, but I'm sure you'll get what I mean. So what is significant to future generations will not to past generations, like the railway generation. The railway generation is the generation that grew up with trains. Trains played a part. That was really central to their lives. What's significant to the railway generation may not be significant to future generations. And that makes identifying values pretty hard to do. One of the most interesting things I saw when I was doing my research was an article by a guy named Thiemeyer, who said that we treat objects as one of three things: as works, works of art, works of design, as specimens, or as witnesses to history. And he says that the way we treat these objects influence the values that these objects are seen through. And in turn, it constrains the meaning that people take away from these objects. So I've just picked some examples that are near and dear to my heart. So as works, you see a number of different engines displayed with shiny spotlights in a beautiful context. And they're viewed often as works of design or as technology or that kind of thing. Specimens, jewels in the jewelry box, like at the National Railway Museum in York, which is on the left, or Expo Rail, which is on the right in Montreal. And then as witnesses to history. And so you see the Governor Stanford, Southern Pacific #1 used in the building of the Central Pacific Railroad, and you see Canadian Pacific, the Countess of Dufferin, celebrated as witnesses to history. And those values then drive a lot of other decisions. They drive collecting decisions. They drive our decisions as to what we operate or we don't because it's too precious, or what we're going to restore or not restore or interpret. And what I'd like you to think about as we move forward is, when you think about some of the objects in your institutions, do you show them off primarily as works or as specimens or as witnesses to history? And what, if you show them off as one, it's hard to show them off as all three. They do overlap, but there's probably going to be one dominant value that you're showing off. What other values have hit the cutting room floor when you emphasize them as works or as specimens? And what other values might help your audiences get more meaning out of these objects? So I'm going to move us on to meaning. So one of my professors at the University of Leicester talked about objects being polysemantic. Poly, many, semantic, meaning. So objects have many potential meanings, but they can't speak for themselves. Objects can't talk. They're deep. They have so much information packed into them, but if you're not familiar with the object, it can be really hard to read. I can read a locomotive pretty well. Cal Sexsmith can read a locomotive pretty well. But if you have not grown up with locomotives, reading a locomotive and getting any kind of meaning out of it could be very difficult. The other thing is that there's always some gaps. The message or the meaning always is incomplete, and viewers fill in the gaps. I'm going to propose that in railway museums and a lot of other kinds of museums, we've been able to depend on nostalgia as kind of an entry point for our audiences. The railway generation could come into our museums. They were nostalgic about trains. Even if your preserved dining car had no tables, no chairs, no smells, the windows were busted and the kitchen was removed, they could walk through a dining car and kind of conjure up that meaning. If you didn't grow up with dining cars, you're going to walk through that empty dining car and think, scrap. So we need to really think about the gaps in the meaning that modern audiences will have and how we fill that in. And objects are super deep. So without going into tons of theory, Van Mensch talked about all these different properties of objects. Fleming talked about properties as well, history, material construction. Van Mensch talked about their various identities. There's a lot of layers of stuff here. And in Canada, man, we have so many values and meanings that railways have. There's no single industry that more profoundly impacted Canada economically, socially, technologically. It's deeply embedded in our psyche. But with generational change, there comes changes in values and meanings. And so we can look at railways through the old lens of an act of national unity by Sir John A. Macdonald and the last spike and all these old white guys in hats and the wonder of smashing a railway through the wilderness. But that makes sense to certain audiences only. And I think as a country, as a sector, we're getting smarter. For modern scholarship tells us that some of those old meanings, those old myths are flawed and wildly incomplete. And so I've picked out two photos. The upper one is from the Crow's Nest Pass in southern Alberta. I've always found this a really moving photograph because you have a First Nations family in the foreground, and the background, here it comes, and life has already been changing radically for them, and it's about to get much worse. And Kent Monkman and his group of works in an exhibition for Canada's 150, Shame and Prejudice, A Story of Resistance. He depicts the railway as a Trojan horse of colonization, a precursor to, and I quote, a long period of dispossession, starvation, incarceration, and genocide of Indigenous people. There's meanings other than these national narratives and national myths. And the good news is our railway story is so packed with so many potential meanings. Historian and author John Hankey said the railways for North America have consequences so profound that we have trouble grasping the ramifications at all. So here we have all these different entry points. We can talk about race, we can talk about immigration, colonization, agriculture, food security, personal safety, energy security, environmental impacts. There's so many lenses we can look at the railway material with. And we haven't really taken the wrapper off in our railway museums, with the exception of Ingenium at Ottawa. They've been redesigning their main galleries through the lens of mobility, which is mobility of people, ideas, and things. That is setting a new standard for how the rest of us can reinterpret our railway objects. So why now and why bother? Well, we've got so much stuff, and sometimes we collected it rationally, and sometimes we didn't know why we collected it, but it showed up. And we're lucky to have a lot of stuff, but collections take resources. And I think in the railway movement, and I think in a lot of transport museums, we're at a bit of a nexus point in terms of our sustainability. I think intuitively we know that we have too much stuff, but you add it up across the nation and it is a massive overaccumulation. So I think there's a call to action here that we need to figure out what matters. And I don't care what kind of collection it is. Figure out what matters so we focus on the gems, so we make sure the gems make the most meaning they can, and so that they're around for future generations. So why would you do it? Well, better sustainability, better public value. If you know what stuff matters in your institution, you can use it to create value for your publics. Obviously, you can create a better collection when you have a good handle on sustainability. You can present it in far better ways. And when people know that your institution has significant material and you know why it's significant and you can transmit that, you're going to get more stakeholder support. You're going to have more control of your collections. Or as my friend Sharon Babian, who's curator of land and marine transportation at Ingenium in Ottawa says, if you can't explain it to yourself, why something's worth preserving, imagine trying to make it meaningful to the public. So we really have to hold our feet to the fire as a sector. There's a couple of genesis points that on this for me that led to this research. Gary Anderson, who was the founding director of the Cranbrook Railway Museum, it's now called the Cranbrook History Center, did an analysis. In the railway world, we have this book called the Trackside Guide, and it lists every single piece of preserved equipment across Canada. Preserved, whether it's sitting in a farmer's field, preserved inside a museum. And he counted every single type of equipment, and it was rather surprising. He found that in the national accumulation of 1,263 locomotives and cars, there are 284 cabooses. Cabooses were the most frequently preserved thing. 44 business cars, which were used for railway executives and officers, and 2 wooden colonist cars. Colonist cars were the Canadian equivalent of the wagon train. So if you were a Martian coming down from Mars to study railways and their importance to Canada, you'd probably reach some weird conclusions. You'd probably assume that railways really, the thing that matters about railways is cabooses and locomotives. And you'd think that colonist cars, based on the number preserved, really didn't matter very much at all. So we have an opportunity nationally and in our institutions to focus on the objects that matter and to understand their significance. As a bit of background, here's what I did to look into this. I spent a year at it, like most people working on their dissertations. I did quite a wide literature review because the literature on significance, especially for large technology objects, is really sparse. So I went down a number of rabbit holes there, also into the notion of national museums and distributed collections. And I did a bunch of research interviews. I talked to 16 different railway, maritime, and aviation museums, 3 sector associations, 1 distributed national collection. I looked through 14 significant frameworks in detail. I busted them out into 36 different criteria, groupings, and then boiled them down to the framework I'm going to show you in a minute. One of the things that was so interesting was in transport and technology museums, we have a tough time. Collecting is difficult, and preserving is even more difficult. Our stuff has lead paint, it has asbestos, it weighs an awful lot. You can't put it in a box and walk it over to another museum. We have long debates about whether we should operate something or not, and we tend to restore things to showroom kind of shininess. We tend to value really minute differences in objects, counting the rivets, if you will, when modern audiences really couldn't care if it had 62 rivets or 63 rivets, and if it was this model of a locomotive or this model. And the good news is we have some emerging thoughts like the social construction of technology and mobility that helps us kind of rise above some of the old meanings. But what's really clear is for past generations, the meanings of railway vehicles were self-evident and they were appealing. But for modern and future generations, not so much. The potential areas of meaning are vast, but we need to do work to unpack those. The institutions I talked to were many and varied. They were in Canada, they were in the US, they were in the UK, Smithsonian Air and Space, Chesapeake Bay Maritime, a whole bunch of railway museums all over the place, including the National Railway Museum in York, which is the biggest and best in the world. It was interesting, the reaction I got. Almost everybody said, thank God somebody's looking at this. And only one organization I spoke to said, why are you looking at this? All that matters is money. Just get us more money. That's all we care about. So it was gratifying to know that everybody else thought this was worthwhile stuff. One of the things that I found was that value and significance are kind of handled in a muddy way in many of our transport institutions. Most everybody I spoke to knows what some of the gems are and kind of why they're gems. But many of them fall into the trap of just thinking of significance when they acquire something or it's time to dispose of it. Very few do regular reviews of their collections. And when they do, it's a pretty mixed up bunch of criteria. And there's a lot of unhelpful practices that have been going on. I found several museums that had literally cut and pasted each other's collections policies, which meant that they had cut and pasted their significance criteria, even though they were at opposite sides of the country. There are some patterns I've found in how people use significance. Two different patterns, systematic or non-systematic. If they were systematic, they had a clear purpose, they had written criteria, they dealt with the facts, it was repeatable. Significance permeated all of their collections policies and practices. Not systematic were the opposite. They didn't have any written processes, they didn't really have the criteria. They went on emotion more than facts, and if they did have criteria, they were a bit of a jumble sale. And on the left-hand axis, there were deductive and inductive. And that just simply means that the deductive institutions, and they were typically national institutions, had done a narrative about the subject. Here's the railway story for Canada. Here's the aviation story for the United States. And then they could hang their collection off of that narrative without having to do much more thinking than that. The inductive institutions tend to have a set of criteria. It's kind of a bottom-up process, and they take the criteria and they apply it to their collections. The one on the bottom right-hand corner, why does it want to update my Adobe right now? Remind me later. Sorry, folks. Is my screen sharing still working?
Yeah, it's still good.
Okay, good, because I'm now in Adobe renewal hell, so my apologies. I need to try and minimize that. Oh, good. So on the bottom right-hand corner, there was one institution that said, everything we have is significant. It's all equally significant. That's why we have it. End of story, which was just an interesting thing. So if you want to take a screenshot, and I know Em is recording this presentation. I'm going to back up. Don't take the screenshot yet. So I found some other patterns. Systematic practitioners had better criteria. They were thinking of the social and cultural significance of things. When they talked about using an artifact, they talked about it as an artifact to engage with educational value. The non-systematic practitioners talked about usability in terms of, can we run it? Can we make money off of it? They viewed things very practically in terms of what will it cost us to acquire it or restore it, and even what's its dollar value. So I'd ask you, where would your institution be? Just think a moment. Are you systematic? Do you have a set of criteria? Do you have processes for this? Is significance baked into your collections policies and processes, or is it not systematic? Is your approach deductive? Do you have a really good fix on the narrative of that story that you tell, and you can hang your collection off of that narrative? Or is it more of an inductive approach to significance that you take, where you have some criteria and you measure your objects against that criteria? So now, screenshot time. Here's the high level criteria that I developed from my research. There's a couple of things I'll say about it. It's divided up into two kinds of values: core values and comparative values. And I found that pattern in some of the really great significance frameworks that I looked at. So think of it as a matrix. Think of it as horizontal and vertical. The horizontal rows are core values. The vertical columns are comparative values. And I'll go through these in a bit more detail, but this is kind of the punchline for, after looking at all these frameworks, after talking to all these museums, after reading all this literature, here's kind of what it boiled down to in the context of a distributed national collection. What I designed was something that I hoped could be brought into any museum, adapted to meet your needs, and you could still get a really good, solid fix on why something was significant. So I'm just going to burrow into each of these a little bit. So the first core value is technology and construction. And so this is the stuff that we often think about in railway museums. So the type, the class, think of a primitive engine or the superpower of the 40s. Technological applications, so first generation diesel technology, superheated boilers. Construction methods. Sometimes the construction was unique, or the craftsmanship, such as the inlaid wood in an early passenger car. In terms of aesthetic values, think of style and design. Think of streamlining. Think of an Art Deco interior. The cultural values. It is a very sad example, but the Jim Crow passenger cars that had one area for black passengers, one area for white passengers, and the radical differences in the comforts of the white passengers and the benches for the black passengers. Think of designers like Raymond Loewy, or some of the designers whose designs influenced the equipment. And the perception or sensory, sometimes it evokes something. Riding on the Prairie Dog Central across the prairie in Winnipeg, I think it changes your DNA. It is such a profound little experience being in those creaky old day cars pulled by a steam locomotive. Suddenly I'm my dad leaving Kindersley to start his career in Rosetown. The third set of core values is historical association. And by historical association, this is the stuff we're all used to. Association with persons, with events, institutions. So events like the Halifax explosion, the Frank Slide, the Winnipeg General Strike, the Royal Tour of '39, the Lac-Mégantic catastrophe. Institutions, the YMCA, the Ontario school system, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, or activities, commuting or ski trains, or the varnished coaches that they'd take from Winnipeg out to the Winnipeg beaches. The fourth set of core values is historical impacts. So what are the social impacts that are reflected in this piece? So think of a colonist car as a great example of the social impact that is connected with railways through an artifact. Think of cultural impacts like the school cars in Northern Ontario. The environmental impacts, again, Lac-Mégantic would be a great example. Economic, agricultural, commercial impacts like the Government of Canada or the Government of Saskatchewan grain cars, or the political and military impacts. So Prince George, the Railway Museum there, has a flat car used for carrying military tanks in World War II, or the Royal cars. The fifth criterion are contemporary social values. So sometimes we get really lucky and our artifacts take on a modern meaning. They are landmarks. Some of our park engines are modern landmarks in our communities. Sometimes a railway car is used as a gathering spot for the community, like a community hall. It's these modern uses, these modern visibilities, this modern meaning that number 5 is meant to deal with, because sometimes our stuff has taken on a new life beyond its operating life. The sixth one is information or research values. So some of our objects have real research value. CN 6400, which is at Ingenium, was developed by the National Research Council. It was an early example of streamlining in Canada. Learning value is the interpretive capacity of the object. And in Canada, there is a replica locomotive of an 1830s engine, and you can see this thing run, and it has, you get a meaning out of it that's really quite wonderful by watching it operate. And sometimes there's this ensemble value. Sometimes objects make more sense when there's a bunch of them. So train cars, passenger cars make sense as a train rather than as individual cars. Operability is baked into learning value. So rather than go down the road of prioritizing operability as a significance, I decided it really belonged under learning value. Operating an engine for its own sake, it may be a revenue generator, but in terms of significance, I think that should be a learning matter. And then the comparative values, and there's 3 of them. And comparative values sort of heighten or lessen the core values. So sometimes an object is really representative. It's a type that was once numerous, and this is a really great example. Sometimes it's a freak. It's an historically unique thing. There was only ever one built. We kept it because it was weird, but it represents an important high water mark in some way or other. Provenance really needs no explanation. Sometimes we know that well-documented objects have more value to them than objects that are badly documented. And integrity, an object that's in great shape. It's original, it's intact, the fundamental design and materials are all there, or it's been restored at an extremely high quality level, would be an example of integrity. So we have core values, we have comparative values. Comparative values dial up or dial down the core values and the significance. So I'm keeping an eye to the time. I'm right on time. A few examples. At the Cranbrook History Center, they have an observation car that was used on the Canadian Pacific called the Curzon. It was built by Barney and Smith, who was a pioneer railway car builder. This thing is so intact, it hurts, right down to the original upholstery. And it was because the car was taken out of service and made into a cabin. It is an incredible example of craftsmanship. The aesthetic, the style and design of this from 1907. It is a rare survivor of a once numerous type. A lot of railway cars used to look like this. It's pretty grand. So these are why this particular car might be significant using my framework. At the Revelstoke Railway Museum, we have an engine that's a type called an SD40. It was the first high horsepower locomotive used on any Canadian railway. All the engines we see on railways now can trace their ancestry back to this type. And so it's really a very important type or class. It represents a really high watermark in terms of technology. A lot of them have now been scrapped. This is a rare representative of that. And it's as it was retired. It's not very good looking right now. We're going to deal with that, but it is largely intact. And for some reason, I can't. Okay, there, I can't advance my screen. There we go. Government of Canada grain cars. So these are icons. I can certainly say that government involvement in farming is a hot topic in my family in Kinnersley. These were an important initiative by federal and provincial governments for grain transport. So they are a very specific type, a very specific construction. They have a very big impact agriculturally, and especially in the prairie provinces, these are kind of iconic. And the Prairie Dog Central in Winnipeg. So this little 440, the oldest operating steam locomotive in Canada, 5 day coaches and a combination car, creaking their way across the prairie. The coaches are largely intact. They're largely original. The locomotive has been heavily rebuilt, so there's not a ton of original material there, but the coaches and the ensemble value of the coaches is really quite extraordinary. The condition is of those coaches is over the top wonderful. And that sensory impact of riding on them is really something. So wrapping up, I've chosen this photo intentionally. We have a collision of values happening here. The values and the meanings that our forebearers had in mind when they collected our objects, and the values that our current and future audiences will bring. And we can't ignore them. We ignore them to our peril. And our sector, our institutions, our transport museums struggle with relevance and sustainability. And so this is an important topic. As a sector in the transport museum world, we should be at least embracing some of the existing frameworks that are available. There are several that are out there. They're good, they're solid. You could adapt them and they would immediately be an upgrade to what most transport museums are using. Or better yet, let's ratify and use our own standard set as a sector that could lead to a nationwide conversation and a distributed collection. Not a collection where we put it all under one roof, but we view the entire nation's holdings as a collection. And we acquire, we restore, we operate, we deaccession based upon that national collection concept. We really need to embrace the scholarship, mobility, social construction of technology, and use that, because that is kind of like the prism that takes the beam of light and makes it explode into a lot of potential meanings. We should use collections registries. The sectors that do have collections registries, they have one in the maritime world, allows museums then to go, who else has one of these things? Do we need to collect one as well? And develop these context documents, those overarching narratives that we can hang our collections from. But at your level, at your museum, in my museum, I think we need to think about how significance is used, how it's approached. Do we do it systematically or not systematically? Do we do it deductively or inductively? When was the last time you formally considered the significance of your rolling stock? Or are you in that situation where you think everything is significant and it's equally significant? And what's one thing you could do to make better use of this concept? I know I go to a lot of webinars, and I know if there's just one good idea I can take away, that's kind of a win. So what's one thing you could do to make better use of this? And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's called Community Conversations. I've been talking far too long. So Em, I'll turn this back over to you to get the conversation going.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, definitely open it up for questions now. If anybody has anything they'd like to comment or ask Jim about, for sure, go right ahead. So we have a question in the chat from Amber Parker. Is that image in the top left corner of the sleeping car porters?
Yes, it's a Canadian Pacific sleeping car porter. We're pretty sure it was a publicity photo taken by the CPR. And it's in one of the modern streamlined coaches they introduced in about 1955, the Canadian. And it's a Canadian Pacific Archives photograph that I use with permission. There's not a lot of photographs of porters around. Oftentimes they're shown in very servile poses. And then when you deconstruct the porter advertising, you often see the white traveler looking down at the porter, which is kind of a fascinating approach. But yes, it's a black Canadian Pacific Railway sleeping car porter.
Thank you.
We have a comment from Marilyn. Thank you, Jim. This presentation was especially meaningful to me as our museum is located in the original Lanigan CPR station.
Oh, wow.
We have a special section about the railway in this area. We, of course, are also infamous because of the 2 train derailments in late 2019 and early 2020.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Cal and I have a railway colleague whose last name is Lanigan, whose family hail from that area, and he's a prominent collector of Henderson's paintings down in Saskatchewan. So lovely to hear from Lanigan. Any
more questions for Jim?
Could I ask a question of the group?
Oh, there's one that popped up.
Great.
I'll get to yours. We'll address it after. What would it take to establish a national framework and registry? Is there a role for a provincial association, for the provincial association or the CMA? And that was from Heather.
Yeah, absolutely. In the railway world, we have a book called the Trackside Guide, which would be a great starting point. I think moving to a registry would probably involve some technology. So getting the thing so it's online. The Trackside Guide is maintained by 2 authors in Ontario. It's published using WordPerfect. They were very kind to loan me their databases, but I couldn't actually get the databases out of WordPerfect into something that I could use to update the counts. I would love to see this done at a provincial level, because I think in Canada, if the provinces start to do this, then it's kind of easy to roll up to a national level. And in terms of what it would take, just some agreement across the institutions in that province to see their information included in a registry. In Canada, we have a new emerging organization, the Heritage Rail Alliance, which is an adaptation of an older organization that Cal and I were part of, the Canadian Council. And we're having conversations again in the railway world at a national level. And that may well stray into territory of a registry, which would be super helpful for us all. The thing that I found so fascinating when I was doing my research was I talked to a guy named Peter Jacob, who's chief curator at Smithsonian Air and Space. He was very generous with his time. And Smithsonian Air and Space, which is arguably among the largest in the world, they tell the story of aviation in the United States from the Wright brothers all the way through, military and civilian. They do not have a B-52 bomber. And a B-52 bomber is, that big honking thing that every aviation museum seems to want to have in America. And I said, why don't you have a B-52? And he said, we don't need one. Everybody else has one. We don't need to collect one as well. We don't need to take its huge footprint and take up space that we could use for other aircraft. And so when they're making their decisions of what's that next airplane we should add to the collection, especially if it's a jumbo jet, they're really looking at the registries and talking to all the other institutions to figure out what's already there, because they don't need to have another one. Even though they may have no ownership of it, they're looking at things as a distributed national collection. And I think that's a really healthy way of looking at this material. So my question for the group was, how many of you use significance now? How many of you have written criteria? They're baked into your collections policies and processes. See one hand up. I can't see I can't see the whole gang, but how many hands are going up, Em, in terms of people that actually have written criteria and you're using them and they're baked into your policies? I think you're, Em, I think you may be muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm having a hard time seeing everybody at once too, but definitely Heather's saying the Western Development Museum does. Kelly Attrell from Grand Coteau somewhat. Yeah. Lanigan does, yeah.
So those of you that have them, do the criteria that I'm proposing, do they make sense relative to your criteria? What are the additions you would make, or what are the ones that maybe you were surprised to see or surprised to not see?
If you want to, if you're so inclined, you can unmute yourselves. And yeah, Jim, maybe we can just stop the screen share for a moment, and then we'll be a little bit more seeing everybody.
There.
Awesome, thank you. Sorry, I may have, I don't know if you want to repeat your question, Jim. I think I may have interrupted you there.
So the question was, for those of you that have significance criteria, were there any that you were surprised to see in my framework or surprised to not see in my framework? Are there ones that you would add or that you don't think are of value?
I'll just say, I guess if Julie's fine with me saying it, we have a lot of similar categories at the Western Development Museum. One of the ones that I saw that you guys were specific about that I found interesting was being very specific about contemporary values. That was an interesting one, to be very specific in outlining those in terms of your criteria. So that I found really interesting.
Nice. I do think that sometimes our stuff takes on some modern meaning, and when it takes on that meaning for modern society, we need to acknowledge that. That's part of its significance here and now and going forward. So thanks for pointing that out.
I'll just jump in here. This is Julie from the WDM. We have a very large steam and gas engine collection. So I'm really looking forward to following up on some reading here, because that's something we're struggling with. And there are many parallels here. These are the same kind of criteria and assessments that we're going to be looking at.
Was that collection put together as by somebody who was kind of being taxonomic about it, that there was this model,
Yeah.
this model, and now you've got the complete set, but
Pretty much, yes.
what do you do with it?
And there was a tremendous value in that back then, but now, of course, it's similar with the railway. What does that mean to people now?
Yeah, when I was doing the research, there was one book in particular, and Em, I can send you a reading list that I thought was really useful when I was doing my research. But they talk about this taxonomic headspace that so many of our institutions were in at one time. Collect the whole set, every single nuanced, minor little difference, and now being saddled with the most representative collection of all time, but that really isn't sustainable or meaningful. Any other questions? Em, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, thanks for the discussion. So we'll wrap it up here pretty quickly. I just wanted to give you a heads up. I know I talked about the next chat, which is with Justin Williams from the RCMP Heritage Center. After that, for the March 31st chat, we are going to do kind of a more of a networking opportunity. I'm kind of thinking of it as a 1-year check-in. You know, we're about 1 year into COVID, or it'll be a little more at that point. So we're going to just use it as an opportunity to check in, think about how are things going in the museum community here. More, you know, we've done surveys and things like that, but this will just be more of kind of an informal talk or opportunity to connect with other people from across the province. After that, April 14th, we have Helena Gessner and Ian Hampton from the Diefenbaker Canada Centre, and they're going to be talking about points of view, bias, interpretation, and emotional response to storytelling in museum spaces, which I think is going to be really interesting. And after that, April 28th, we have Julie Mashinsky, and she's going to be talking about decolonizing Canadian ethnographic collections. Again, I think it's going to be really interesting. So I just wanted to give those a shout out. That is everything for me today, I think. Just wanted to say thanks again to everybody for joining us. Thank you to Jim for your presentation. Much appreciated. Yeah, sorry, just one comment from Heather, thought from earlier. It's a challenge to find out what other museums have when trying to figure out if it's an object that's well preserved in other collections. Yeah, I can imagine.
I actually just have one more quick question for Jim. I'm just kind of wondering, like, you talked a lot in your presentation about the social and historic value of things and how sometimes that value may be independent from the value of the physical artifact itself. So say, for instance, it's like, I don't know any train terminology, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But like, say it's the first ever train where that had a female conductor or something, right, in Canadian history. Like, would your recommendation be to preserve that physical object, or to kind of, if it's a really common otherwise physical artifact, would your recommendation be to still preserve that artifact or to kind of integrate that story into an existing, I guess, like existing collection that's already there?
I'll give you a one-word answer, yes to both. So yes, in the sense that I think that those stories are very useful to leverage on any object. So let's say you have a sleeping car. I see no reason why every single railway museum in Canada could not interpret their sleeping cars and include the story of Black Porters. It is a really, really important story about race and discrimination in our country. And your sleeping car is a brilliant vehicle, pardon the pun, a brilliant vehicle for carrying forward that story. So the other side of it that I also said yes to is, yeah, if you can factually connect an object to a person or that kind of thing, I think that adds to its significance. Now, if it's a caboose and there's 280 cabooses across the country, maybe that's a reason for that particular caboose to its significant bumps up a little. I don't know if it would be enough to say absolutely preserve that one, put it in bubble wrap forever.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure, but it's something that would bump up its significance, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
I think of a railway car that's in Alberta, and it's developed this legend around it. And people say, oh, this was Diefenbaker's private car. It wasn't his private car. He rode in it when he was campaigning. But it was not assigned to him. And it's taken on this kind of legendary meaning. And there's very little of the car actually left that's original. And so I think that's sort of a cautionary tale to go, make sure you get the facts really well worked out. Make sure that if this is associated with a person, it really is. It's not that, that old legend of, this was George Washington. George Washington slept here for one night out of a lifetime of 80 years.
Well, and like, what does that really matter? Also, yeah.
I think, right?
I had one comment kind of for relating to what Heather just asked about how to find out who has what. The Canadian Heritage Information Network, CHIN, is, even though they were terribly decimated in terms of funding and their staffing, they are working to revitalize Artifacts Canada.
Oh.
Is the kind of a stripped down database of objects in Canadian museums. And I think that could, if, fingers crossed, they are able to get that functioning again, because it was so old, it was like it belonged in a museum. But if they can get that working, I think that could have the functionality for specialized collections like a railway collection, or for museums like the WDM, who have so many different specialized collections, to see whether someone else has a similar representative object, so you don't have to collect it, or you can point people to that space, especially as people are becoming more and more comfortable because of this past year with looking at things virtually, so that they don't need to see it here if they know it exists and is preserved in Winnipeg, sort of. So just something that it struck me when that comment came up from Heather.
I really like that. I think the future for all of us really lies in getting, and the technology is so much easier than it used to be, getting these registries pulled together. Because I think if the more we look at our entire country as a national collection in a distributed way, I think we just all suddenly have so much more potential information to help us make collections decisions.
Yeah, Jim, just a quick comment, just when you're talking about the supposed Diefenbaker car in Alberta, and we're actually just tracking down a bit of an artifact right now, trying to get a bit more information on it. But last summer, a fellow came in with his father's Via Rail conductor's uniform, and his father was one of the conductors on Diefenbaker's funeral train. So we're now trying to determine, and the guy who donated it, his father is still alive and is still, able to, respond to questions. But because of the pandemic, he's had trouble connecting with him. But anyway, he's going to, first of all, we want to, okay, which portion of the run was he on? Number one. And number two, did his father save this uniform because that was the one he wore when he was on the train? And the guy says, he said, I'd like to say yes, but I won't because I don't know for sure. But he says, I'm hoping Dad remembers. So I think that kind of gets into that. All of a sudden that uniform becomes much more significant if that is indeed the case.
Right on. Good story.
Awesome. Well, we are at 11, which is kind of where we try to wrap things up. So definitely not rushing anybody out if you have any other further comments or questions. But if we don't see anything kind of coming up here, we'll probably shut it down. And I really look forward to seeing you all at some future chats. And thanks again for joining us today. And thanks again, Jim.
Thanks very much, everybody. Take care.
Have a great week.